Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. Ready, begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Would the clerk please call roll?
Okay. Am I on? Commissioner White?
What?
I didn't do it. Sorry. Commissioner White?
Here.
Wow, that's loud. Commissioner Dugas?
Here.
Commissioner Kessley?
Here.
Oops, hold on a second. Hold on.
Now is the time for public comments. This is time set aside for comments by citizens on matters that are not appearing on the agenda. I don't have any cards. Moving on. Now it's item 5, approval of the October 19, 2017 minutes.
I would like to make a motion to approve the minutes of October 19, 2017.
I second that one.
Please vote as soon as our screens are up.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Okay, it's fast. Moving to the meat of the agenda. It's PL 17-0132, commercial cannabis. Good morning, Mr. Stevens.
Good morning, Mr. Dugas. Members of the I'm Chris Stevens with the Resource Management Agency, and I'm here today to talk to you about a recommended amendments to our non-coastal zoning ordinances. I'll try not to set this off too much. The first point I wanted to make really for you today was that this is related to, as it says, commercial cannabis use. So nothing we're going to be talking about today has any relationship to personal use. That's regulated entirely or almost entirely by the state. So we're focusing on the commercial aspects of it today. What I wanted to do was to try and kind of keep it simple and focused today, and there's lots of issues associated with cannabis, and I'm not going to be trying to cover all of them, but please feel free if you have questions as I run through this to stop me and ask questions. But I'm going to try and focus on the task at hand, so to speak. Where do you want me to point this? Try that. There we go. Okay. What I thought would be helpful would be to kind of run through the chronology of cannabis law and some of the actions taken here at the board, at the county. So it's been a while since we've been talking about this with the Planning Commission, but it really kind of started with the in October 2015. What became known as the Medical Marijuana Regulation and Safety Act, MRSA, was the common reference point. That established kind of the law and the regulations for medical marijuana. We referred to marijuana at the time. They've changed it since to make sure all references are to cannabis. I'll try and stick to cannabis from here on out if I can. One of the most important elements of that law, and take a moment to describe it, was it established a dual permitting system, and what that was a state and local permitting system. It's had some nuanced changes, but I think the essential elements of it are unchanged today. And so there's really kind of three scenarios that you would have. One would be there is no ordinance at the local level addressing it. And if that's the case, then if some entity gets themselves a state permit to operate, they would be allowed to operate in the local jurisdiction. Another scenario would be that the local jurisdiction has a prohibition or a ban. If that is the case, then the state is not allowed to issue permits to entities within those jurisdictions. And then the third scenario would be if you have a local ordinance in place to allow and regulate. And in that scenario, an entity would have to have both the local permit and the state permit in order to operate. So kind of give you that kind of as a background. That was essentially established with MRSA in 2015. The other element of that law was that it had in it a deadline. Some of you probably remember that, that required local governments to adopt ordinances by, I think it was March 7th or something. It was kind of an odd date, but it was early March of 2016, and that if a local jurisdiction did not adopt regulations by that date, they were prohibited from doing so, and state law would prevail. So because of that, we had to hurry up and get through a process here at the local level, and on December 15th, the board directed us to prepare ordinance amendments to prohibit commercial medical cannabis activities. So January 14th, we brought that to your commission. You recommended adoption, and then in January 26th of 2016, the board adopted that. It went into effect 1 month later, and that is the status of our ordinances today. And what we're recommending to you here is some amendments to bring those up to date. So some more kind of recent and current activities. In November of last year, the voters approved the Adult Use of Marijuana Act, and that now allowed commercial cannabis activities not related to medical, just simply adult use. It established age of 21, so anyone 21 years of age or older would be able to obtain from a permitted facility by the state cannabis. So the interesting thing to note about that law is it establishes a deadline of, or not a deadline, excuse me, a target of the state initiating its permitting by January 1st, 2018. So that's now kind of the date that we're working from today, and in fact is why we're here today with this item. Since, in essence, the medical marijuana laws were passed, and then with the adult use measure passing, the state's been frantically trying to develop its regulations, guidelines. They've had many versions of it. The state's rulemaking process, in essence, requires about a year. So, and that's on a good day. So they've been working very hard. There's been lots of versions of it. And then what happened with on June 27th was that the legislature passed SB 94, which in essence kind of merged the medical and adult use regulations, and the state has had to start over. So the regulations they had in place, the draft ones that were out for review, have essentially been set aside, and they're now working on new rules and regulations. Needless to say, they cannot complete them by January of next year, right, under the standard rulemaking process. So it's that's my way of saying it's rather chaotic. What they're going to have is kind of emergency permits and temporary permits or interim permits, whatever terminology you prefer. It's a little unsettled, to say the least. We would, and at one point we were working on regulations for medical marijuana, and we're relying heavily on the state rules, as I think we should. We would like to be as consistent with them as possible, given the state or status of what's going on at the state. Even if we'd wanted to do that today, I don't think that we could, because we just simply don't know what those rules are quite clearly. Where that leads us to here now is that on September 26th, the board decided to move forward, and in advance of that January 1st, 2018 deadline, direct staff to prepare amendments to the ordinances, and that's what's before you today, to expand our prohibition so that it applies not only to medical but also to adult use commercial activities. And those are the amendments that you have in front of you today. A couple things, and if you want to talk about them, we can, but there were a couple other directives from the board on the 26th. Those aren't in front of you today, but I'll just share them with you. The board also directed that we take a look at industrial hemp and whether or not we have the authority to regulate it, how we might regulate it, and then do some analysis and report back to them. That work is ongoing. That is also a rather unsettled area at the state, and I don't imagine that we will have anything back to the board until after the first of the year. Our efforts have been initially on making sure we meet the deadline with the prohibition. The second thing that occurred at that September 26th hearing was that Supervisors Bennett and Zaragoza handed out a letter indicating that they were going to return to the board next month with a proposal for directing staff to move ahead with some regulations to allow a very limited amount of commercial medical cannabis activities in the county. That's something that the Planning Commission talked about, and we worked on for quite some time, and then was set aside by the board earlier this year, and now they're coming back to ask the board to pick it back up and start working on it.
Could you tell me again which supervisors those was?
That
Bennett
was
and Zaragoza?
yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
So I don't have anything to report on that. They're going to be coming back next month. I don't know the details on what their proposal will be, but they handed out a letter on the 26th just with some kind of general guidelines. They did mention they wanted to keep it limited to one permit for dispensary, cultivation, manufacturing, so it'll be a very, very limited program that they'll be proposing, but I don't know the details of it. So we're here today, as I said, to present to you our recommended amendments to the non-coastal and coastal zoning ordinances to affect the directive of the board. This is just kind of highlighting for you the changes, and really what we're doing is in addition to expanding this to adult use as well as medical, we're updating our references. So if you see kind of in the lighter shaded there that's been that we're proposing to remove, there were references to code sections that are no longer relevant because we're trying to be as specific as we can. And so what we're removing those code sections and then really just changing the language. And here's just kind of the now, if you get rid of the legislative version, this is what it would look like. The definition of commercial cannabis activity that's referenced there in the Business and Professions Code is in your Exhibit 5 in your packet if you're interested in looking at the details of that definition. Again, our goal has always been to be as consistent with state law as possible to avoid confusion for folks, and that's why we've tried to make these references to state law where we can. This is just similar. The language was slightly different in the coastal zoning ordinance, but it is the same concept, which is expanding it to adult use and updating our code section and references. So there's the language as we're recommending it be adopted. So with that, our recommended actions are before you. I think they're pretty standard ones that we find that it's exempt from CEQA, and that the text amendments are in the interest of public health, safety, and welfare for the County of Ventura, and that you recommend to the board that they adopt the zoning ordinance amendments and specify the clerk of the board as the holder of those items. So with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much. Usually we have disclosures now, but because this is something before the whole county, we don't need to do that. So questions of staff by the commission? Are there any at this time?
I have one question. What is the status of the hemp investigation or analysis?
I would, and county council may want to jump in. I know they're doing a lot of work as well. Very early stages. As I said, our focus here has been getting the work done to get these ordinances in place. They don't go into effect until 30 days after adopted, so they have to be adopted in November in order to be in effect by January 1. Started to collect some information. I've talked to staff from the California Department of Food and Agriculture. They are the ones overseeing what is called the Industrial Hemp Advisory Board in Sacramento, and they are just having some meetings and talking about the regulations. It was a back burner issue up in Sacramento that is now kind of there's been an interest generated in industrial hemp, so they're really picking up and working on it. But as of today, they don't even have regulations in place. But I don't know if Linda wants to add anything.
Do you want more information on it, or
Is that?
Well, I think when the staff has some information to present, yes, but.
Okay. We'd be happy to do that. As I said, I don't anticipate we'll be back to the board until after the first of the year, but we can certainly share that information with the Planning Commission as well.
Commissioner Kessley?
Chris, I do have a question about the difference between an A license and an M license.
Okay. And I probably can't answer that question right now. They've changed the licensing since the report I think I did for the Planning Commission, a year and a half ago, and they've added some new license types. And because of the board, a majority of the board, in essence, directing us not to work on that. I haven't really dug into those details. If the board directs us to work on that, we'll obviously get into that in a lot of detail and be able to answer those questions for you. But for today, Linda may be able to
I know the answer. So the license structure was merged under SB 94, but there's still different licenses for adult use and medical, and the A's for adult use and the M is for medicinal.
Thank you. So now I'll open the public hearing and call for speaker cards. I have one. Mike Plater, please state your name and your city of residence, please. Good morning.
Mike Plater, thank you. I think there should be a caveat to the recommendations that Chris brought forward, and I think that...
Pardon me, could you give us your city of residence, please?
Oh, I'm sorry, it's unincorporated Ventura County in the Moore Park area.
Thank you.
Excuse me, with the caveat that I think that the AE zoning, agricultural exclusive, should be exempted from this. I believe that commercial production of cannabis should and would go outside. I believe that the only areas that it would go outside in would be the agricultural areas of Ventura County. I also believe that the county is missing a very big part of the equation, in as much as commercial pharma, big pharma, sooner or later will come to growers and ask them to grow the product for them so that they can process it and put it in a pill form or some other form that is easier for patients who are dealing with terminal illnesses or major pain to accept. The way it's drafted right now, with just a clear, flat no, seems a little much, in as much as it's an overgrab, and won't allow any other ideas to go forward in the future. With the opioid epidemic that we have, I've talked to many people, and they feel, as well as I do, that the cannabis could provide a buffer with that, could diminish it, and could help many, many patients as we all get older in our lives and we all succumb to various forms of cancer and diseases and just pains in general. I've talked to some farmers in this county, as I have been an avocado grower in this county for about 25 years now, although my crop was destroyed in a wildfire a number of years ago. And I would be willing to actually take my 40-some-odd acres and just put it into a 1-acre test plot for the county to see what works and what doesn't work. When we keep pushing this off, it just puts the farmers in this county in a bad position, because there will be, especially for outdoor growing, there will be years needed to figure out what strains work best in outdoor, in the microclimates that each of us have in this county. And I believe it will also promote underground indoor growing in this county, which we're all trying to get away from. So again, I feel that there's some merit to what Chris brought forward, but I think that there should be some forward thinking, in as much as to leave our agricultural areas open to the discussion of this, and let our farmers who have done well for years in this county look at this, and go forward with maybe Big Pharma. And I mean, to be quite frank, my ideal idea would be that I grow 1 acre of cannabis, and Big Pharma just comes and gets it all, and I don't have to parse it into little pieces. I don't have to put it into bags. I don't have to do anything with it. I just want Pharma to get it, to process it, and put it in something that a doctor can give to a real patient and not someone who is coming across with this physician's recommendation who just wants to get high. And I think that's where this whole discussion needs to move forward. It needs to get to the people who really, really need it. And that's what I hope you guys can help with. All right, thanks so much.
Thank you, sir. Any questions? Thank you again. And that's it for comments cards that I have. Does anyone else want to speak? No? Okay.
I have a question.
Question.
And maybe, Chris, you could answer this best. For patients within Ventura County who have a legitimate doctor's prescription for medical marijuana, what options do they have to get it?
Right. Well, at this point, I know there are licensed medical cannabis dispensaries in Los Angeles County, Santa Barbara County. I believe, I'm not sure the status of those in Ojai, and I don't think anything is open yet in Port Hueneme. There were, and I don't, and they are, I think, within the city, so I'm not terribly familiar with them. There may be some still operating under the old medical marijuana structure as loose as it was. I'm not sure of that, but anyone who has a recommendation who needs the medicine can get it from a licensed facility, and it can be delivered to them here in Ventura County.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Unless there's, I think I'll close the public hearing. I just want to ask, like, kind of a technical question. I want to recognize Chris Stevens again for all the work that he did over the past year and a half, 2 years regarding this issue. There were public meetings. There were a lot of different opinions. It's a more complicated issue than at first glance. I learned a lot participating in that process. And the Board of Supervisors has given direction to, I think, to sum it up, it's to go slow. And my question is, there's 3 of us, the action that we're taking seems to be very technical. It seems to be housekeeping to make sure that we are just referencing up-to-date state guidelines. If it failed here, what would happen? There's 3 of us.
I was going to let
Now,
the county
there's-
council answer.
No,
Yeah,
there's
I
3 of
understand.
us. If there was a 2-1 vote,
Right.
what would happen?
There would be, you wouldn't take the recommended action, right? The
Yeah, no
recommended action
action
would
taken.
fail. And given the deadline, and I would maybe defer to Linda on this, we would move forward to the board with a recommendation from the Planning Commission to not adopt the amendments.
Okay, but the amendments aren't really substantive. They just appeared to be, they're not a different direction than what the board had before. And how it's circling back to the Planning Commission, I was looking at it thinking, this is just the same. Did I miss something? Because to me, it just looked like technical differences.
There are technical differences. You are right in terms of our updating references to the correct laws and code sections. But there is a policy difference in the sense that this is expanding our prohibition to beyond medical. Right now, the prohibition is strictly medical and not commercial adult use. So the change, and I would call it a very substantive change, would be to expand the prohibition to include all commercial cannabis activities, not just medical.
Well, also keep in mind, last time we were here, on the medical cannabis, Prop 64 hadn't been passed. So there's a whole new law that has come into effect. It has a huge substantive impact insofar as if the county just does nothing on January 1st, the way it works is the state will start issuing, presumably, as Chris pointed out, there's a lot going on up there, but let's just assume that they're able to issue permits on January 1st. They'll start issuing permits, and then they'll look to the locals to see, and there's literally a process in SB 94 to effectuate this. They'll look down at the local government and say, well, what's your regulation in this area? Let's say they're trying to get a license to be a retailer, and if the county has none, then they won't take that into account, and they'll just issue the license, and then they'll come down and operate in the county to the extent that they can. They're still going to be faced with whatever, whatever zones their retail could possibly be allowed, which may be none. But in any event, there's no. It's kind of a free for all. Same for cultivation. That they get their cultivation license. They look down to the county, and the county has no say on adult use cultivation. We'd have to be dealing with that. So the board just says, there's not enough time to think this out. Let's just ban it now. And that way we don't have to face that on January 1st, the unknown variable of states issuing licenses. And there's, I think maybe, Commissioner, you're familiar with this, there's many different license types out there for distribution, testing labs, manufacturing, retailing, cultivating, etc. And so theoretically, they're all going to start to be issued on January 1st. So it is very substantive, because if we don't, it could have a huge impact in the county, potentially, if we don't take a step in that regard. And as far as if you vote 2-1 on this issue, there'd be no action. I don't know. I'd have to think about this a little bit more to say for sure. I have to research it, but I think we would just say that the Planning Commission took no action on it.
And then would it
Not
just
so
go
much.
without a recommendation from the Planning Commission? The board could still take their direction.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. You see what I'm struggling with?
I understand. And we talked about that, knowing there would only be 3 commissioners today, where this might end up. But it would either go, I think, with no recommendation from the Planning Commission, which might be the more logical way to go, since you're not taking any action, or conversely, I suppose it could be that you failed to recommend adoption. I don't know what it's
I just
It's just
wonder
language at this point, but it would go forward.
Okay.
It's a zoning amendment, so it has to come to the Planning Commission
Right.
by state laws.
Right.
Okay. What obligation does the Planning Commission have to follow board direction? Is it when the board decides on a policy, what discretion is left to the individual planning commissioners to follow it or not?
Well, in this particular case, I mean, there's many different items that come to the Planning Commission, but in the context of a zoning amendment, you're a recommending body, so they've directed staff to bring this to the Planning Commission to consider it. Yes, they've obviously indicated an intent that they want to go towards banning it, but it's your duty to evaluate it based on this hearing today and make your recommendation. It can be whatever the Planning Commission decides to recommend. Eventually, the board is going to take the action it's going to take based on the information that it's learned and from your investigation here and your recommendation to the board.
Okay. Thank you. Go ahead, Commissioner Kessler.
Chris, for clarification's sake, I am a landlord, tremendous amount of industrial commercial properties and land. And I probably have a list of 20 questions because obviously whatever decisions are made, it's going to impact especially landlords that have multi-tenant businesses. So if the county and cities aren't in a position yet to figure out how to regulate all of that. It leaves the landlord with that ultimate responsibility. And as I look at some of the state's definitions, if I was to put, say, as a use, manufacture, well, that basically opens up the door to, and if I didn't know better, the means to compound, blend, extract, infuse, and otherwise. And as I have learned through attending multiple seminars, there are ways that THC is extracted that can blow up buildings. Who's going to regulate that? What regulations are in place? And if there are none at this point in time, doesn't it make much more sense for us to stall the process until all of that is in place?
Well, do you want me to address that?
Well, I would, there are regulations in state law, and if we were to move forward with an ordinance, as we were doing at one point in time, we had very rigorous guidelines and standards and inspections that would be done to ensure that we, whatever is allowed is done in a safe manner.
There's also two types of licenses for manufacturing, one involving volatile substances and one that doesn't.
Right.
So in theory, the way that this would work out, if you were interested as a manufacturer in an industrial zone and getting involved in manufacturing, you'd have to decide which type of license you want to pursue. Assuming you want to pursue the volatile type of license that for manufacturing cannabis, you'd have to go to the state. The state needs to adopt regulations. The state is the one that's looking very intently into all the safety concerns, and most of those kind of regulations are going to come from the state. They're going to make sure that your laboratory has all the necessary safety measures in place, and there'll be a long list of regulations in the California Code of Regulations that will apply to these manufacturers. So then presumably they can get through all that, and they can get their manufacturing license from the state. Then they'd come down to the county, and meanwhile they'd be working with the county the county would say, are you going to be allowing volatile manufacturing in any of your zones? And let's just say, for argument's sake, we said yes, we're going to allow it in this industrial zone over here or whatever. Then we would know at the local government that they've met all those requirements because they were issued their state license, which has a laundry list of protections to make sure it's safe. And then we could add additional regulations that we were allowed to see. Again, it's hard to say where we're preempted and not preempted since they haven't even adopted anything yet. But then when they did have all that, they come down to the locals. We would then be in a better position to say, okay, the state said they have to do all these things. The state said the locals have the authority to regulate here and there. Presumably, again, it's going to be with respect to zoning and permit requirements and those kind of things. And then they would come in and presumably get a CUP if, all this was allowed. We'd look at all that to make sure it was safe. So, again, that's how it would work. But realistically, you can't even come down to the city or the county or any city or county in the entire state of California for commercial cannabis until you get your state license, if that helps.
Yes, and what I guess I'm getting at is all of that already in place so that they're ready to go January 1st?
Just as a matter of educating myself, yeah, January 1st, 2018, midnight, it's a go.
Yeah,
Right, but do they already have all of those? Have they gone through my list of 20 questions to have the answers to that?
There are a myriad of regulations governing hazardous materials. We have a CUPA program that's operated in our environmental health division. Anyone who handles, whether you're a cannabis manufacturer or some other manufacturer, you come into our hazardous materials business program. We inspect, we keep track of all of those things. Now, if someone violates that, that's another issue. But I mean, regardless of the activity, there are many rules this thick in place to govern those.
But I'm not just referring to the hazardous part of it. I'm talking about insurance issues, protections for multi-tenant, people that odors and smoke, and I mean and I'm already experiencing it because I've got illegal activity going on and bootlegging. It's so broad and there's so many collateral issues that I don't think we have really identified and addressed yet. And it's one of those things. I don't think we should fire AIM. I think we should take our time and think it through and make sure that there are protections for landlords, for tenants, for just people in general before we just say, let's do it. That's my feeling.
Right. And I think that comports with where the board was coming from and when they had us working on these processes that Commissioner Dukas mentioned for quite some time, working on those guidelines. Those came to a halt earlier this year, and so we didn't get to they didn't mature to the level where I'd be able to answer all of those questions. But certainly that's the intent, and one of the reasons we're here today is because we need to get those things in place so our comfort level is high enough before we proceed.
Any other questions? Okay, I've closed the public hearing, and I just want to, do you have any comments before I go?
Well, I think it is important to have local control on this issue, as we should have on most issues that we deal with in the county. It seems strange to say no in Ventura County when the voters have made their opinions clear as to legalization. However, if not approving these changes to the zoning ordinances would cause the state to come in and tell Ventura County, this is the way you're going to do it. We're going to do it for you in Ventura County. I think that would be a mistake. And by approving the recommendation of staff, then we allow the county staff and the Board of Supervisors to develop regulations within Ventura County that make sense for Ventura County, and that's what I'm in support of.
I don't disagree with either one of you. However, we did a lot of work on this, and I was very sorry to see it stopped. I understand that the board has taken a direction, and I really like your phrase there, fire aim. But I look at 14,000 plants that were found in Los Padres National Forest. That's not the first time. It happens in the arroyos and ravines in our area of Thousand Oaks and throughout the county. There is a need, there is a demand, and I think that as a government that's responsive to the people, I think there's an obligation to make sure that there is a path going forward so that people can obtain this cannabis in a legal manner. And by doing nothing, I think that we drive it, we don't stamp it out. It doesn't stop the illegal activity. And I very strongly believe that we need to move forward with where we were going before it was stopped for a lack of whatever it was that stopped it. So that's my, those are my thoughts, and I'll call for a vote now. Oh, no, I'm going to call for a motion.
I would make a motion to approve staff recommendations for PL 17-0132.
I'll second that.
Now I'll call for the vote. And thank you for the clarification on what that does. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Moving on, now it's discussion. Item 7, report by the planning director on board actions and other matters.
Thank you, Commissioner Dukas. I don't have anything new since we met last week. We pretty much went over the schedule last week. The only thing that I see that was added was an item for November 30th. And I'm going to see what I can do to move that item to the 7th if possible, because you already have an item on the 7th. So I'm going to check with staff today to see if there was a reason that item had to be on the 30th. But so we'll stay tuned for that.
Okay, and I'd like to ask, when we have our general plan update,
Yes.
what are we expecting, and what will the Planning Commission be doing on that date?
So you will be hearing several things on that date. You'll be reviewing the background report. You'll also be reviewing the vision and guiding principles. So we worked on that as a commission before it went out to the public. So it went out to the publics and the municipal advisory councils, and you'll see their comments back on that. And so we're going to ask that you put that document in a final form, seeing if there's, going out to the community, if there was anything in there that you thought was a good idea, that you want to update, that you want to incorporate, because we do want to have the Planning Commission move that Vision and Guiding Principles document to the board and ask the board to adopt that both the background report and the Vision and Guiding Principles are important, that they're important building blocks for the rest of the project. We're also going to go over the analysis that was done for the phone survey that the board asked that we do. So there was quite an extensive survey that was done, and we're just moving through the results of that. So we'll be sending that along. That will be a part of the staff report. So the combination of those three things is what we're going to ask you to look at and edit if you feel necessary, and then move those items forward to the board, because we need to get started on other aspects of the projects, and that will be the alternatives analysis, and a lot of this work will be towards the alternative and towards the alternative analysis and the EIR that we'll begin working on.
Okay. Any other questions of staff? Anything else that the commission wants to bring forward? Seeing none, I'll close today's meeting.